So I'm Zoe, and I'm here to talk about, I work primarily in philosophy of mathematics, not in philosophy of physics, and I work on mathematical rigor in particular. So I want to talk today about a sort of epistemic injustice in mathematical physics, well, in mathematical rigor that extends to physics. So our case study today will be a physics case study. But along the way, I will also introduce my view of mathematical rigor, which I think some of you might enjoy. Maybe some of you will hate it. It'll be very exciting to find out. Let's start. Okay, so a lot of recent work in epistemology has focused on this sort of ethical epistemological dimension, where we're thinking about the generation and transmission of knowledge as having certain social features. And sometimes those social features turn out to be biased. That's not unsurprising. But it largely hasn't extended to our research on mathematics and the philosophy of mathematical knowledge. So one of the things I want to attend to today is that issue of the ethical and epistemological dimension of mathematical rigor and mathematical proofs. And here I am thinking about rigor in terms of proofs. So I'm not thinking about rigor's definition here, although that's an interesting discussion we might have later. I don't know exactly what to do with it. But I am thinking about rigor's proofs, what it is to give an argument that's rigorous. And yeah, so to do that, we'll introduce a new account of rigor, and we'll show that it kind of helps to examine these epistemic injustices in mathematics relating to mathematical rigor judgments and the sort of use of that in physics. Okay, so we'll start by talking about epistemic injustice, in case you're not super familiar with it. We'll talk about the audience view of rigor, which is my view of rigor, and then we'll think about a case of mathematical rigor in physics, and a case of injustice in that sense. So, again, goals for this section, let's talk about epistemic injustice, and in particular, participatory injustice. So, in 2007, Miranda Fricker argues that there are different forms of, there's these kinds of injustices that are distinctly epistemic. Epistemic in that they harm the person as a knower, and an injustice because it's not a just harm, right? There's no sense in which they deserve to be harmed as a knower. And it has to be along the dimension of some identity prejudice. So one of the sort of ideas here is that identities are entering into mathematical rigor judgments in a way that has not been previously attuned to. That's the claim. So two of the examples of or types of epistemic injustice that she discusses are testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So these testimonial injustices are where we assign a lower credibility to a testifier on the basis of some social identity that they have. And a hermeneutical injustice is where we sort of deny certain knowers concepts required to explain their lived experiences or to explain experiences. So the classic hermeneutic injustice is sexual harassment in the workplace. Women didn't have the concept to describe what was happening to them, and so they were denied a part of their epistemic landscape and their way to make sense of the world. But we've also introduced all sorts of new kinds of epistemic injustice in the meantime. In 2010, Hokwe suggests that there's another kind of injustice called a participatory injustice. And this has been taken up as sort of most of the literature on mathematical practices and epistemic injustice is focused on this participatory concept. The idea is that there are epistemic activities beyond testimony and concepts. In particular, we might inquire, we might deliberate, we might propose ideas, we might merely discuss. And those are themselves epistemic, knowledge-generating activities that don't involve testimony or a particular concept to sort of frame our conceptual landscape. And the idea behind these is that a participatory injustice occurs when an agent is viewed as incompetent to carry out a particular epistemic activity on the basis of their identity. This is going to matter because what we'll talk about moving forward is a kind of definition of rigor that involves a participation, a sort of audience-based participation. So the classic example that Hokwe gives is a woman's perceived shyness in a philosophy classroom. So it's being interpreted as a kind of incompetence, which means that she is less able or viewed as less able to participate in epistemic discussion. So discussion would be the key epistemic activity in philosophy, which makes that harm epistemic. The fact that the prejudice is associated with her gender is a part of her social identity, thus satisfying these two conditions on being a kind of epistemic injustice. we have this natural question, and the reason I got interested in this actually was because I presented my view of mathematical rigor, and somebody in the audience was like, well, your view can't be right, because if it were right, then there would be these problems where we could have epistemic injustice in math. And I said, oh, no, that's exactly, you're right. We have that. That's not a modus tollens. So the question, right, is can this happen in particular when we think about rigorous proof? Right? So not just can there be epistemic injustice in math, but can it happen when we think about rigor and proof? And I think the answer to that is going to be yes. So we think, some people, that audience member certainly thinks that proof is this very objective object. It's formalizable, right? So this comes back to that standard view of rigor that Kareem mentioned. We'll talk about that a little bit. And this formalizability is not social. Right? It's merely a fact about the words on the page or the symbols on the page and some system that we could compare it to, translate it to. So the idea is that if we have this sort of standard view of mathematical rigor, or standard view of proof, then there's no sense in which we have deep injustices. We might have an injustice where a woman says, I have a proof, and no one listens, and that's just a mere sort of testimonial injustice. But there's nothing deep about it. This is the suggestion, at least. You might think that, like, whoever said that is wrong, but I've met actually a surprising number of people who've said things like this. So it's worthwhile, I think, to be able to examine or identify examples of epistemic injustice that do involve rigor in a sort of deep sense, because I think it's going to be there. So we have some examples of injustice in mathematics that are not necessarily all the way to that sort of deep mathematical rigor. So one example coming from Rydberg is the idea that there are these ghost theorems that are sort of so accepted that no proof is necessary, or the proof is like believed to be there but no one needs to publish it. And so anyone who wants to publish on that topic or on that theorem is denied the ability to participate in publication and dissemination of their work, because they seem to lack a sort of secret knowledge about what's proved, or what's assumed to be proved, and what's not. And Tenzel and Rydberg also argue later in a different paper that enforcing an acontextuality of proof is also a source of participatory epistemic injustice. So the idea that, like, in particular learners, so children, I don't know, it doesn't have to be children, but in a pedagogical sphere, if you enforce very strictly the idea that proof comes from, like, just this formal bit of the world, then you're actually you're eliminating certain groups of students who are not used to the idea that knowledge can be generated without context. So we have these examples of some mathematical epistemic injustice, but it's not necessarily clear that they have to do with rigor, right? Some proofs are just considered uninteresting to a community in a sort of biased way, and then some ways of teaching mathematical proof might be an injustice. But I think we can find them even in the judgments of rigor to the very proofs themselves. And so that's what we're going to think about next. Perfect. So in order to do that, though, I think that we'll need a different account of mathematics. So the goal here is to try and motivate an epistemic importance of rigor in mathematics, and then to try and introduce my view of mathematical rigor. And along the way, I want to point out that this view of mathematical rigor, I think, will extend to a Kareem called physicist rigor. Okay? So I don't think that mathematical rigor is all that different from the physicist rigor. I think that we can have a unifying account, and indeed that it might all the way extend to legal rigor or philosophical rigor. So the idea is that in mathematics, at least, to possess the knowledge of a theorem, one must have a proof or know of a proof. We know that that's not exactly true, right? There are those ghost theorems that are just accepted. But the idea, at least if you push a mathematician, is that you have to have a proof in order to say you know a theorem. And a necessary feature of those proofs is that they are rigorous. And so there's this epistemic activity. I want you to think of this practice of giving, receiving, and evaluating these proofs along the dimension of rigor as an epistemic activity. Not necessarily one of testimony, not necessarily one that's hermeneutic, but certainly a sort of practice much like discussion and evaluation of ideas. So evaluating the rigor of the proof will be the epistemic activity of interest. So what's rigorous proof? Well, I have an answer. So there are many different kinds of goals that you might have when you try to give a theory of rigor. And one may be interested in just describing which proofs are rigorous and which are not, so a sort of extensionally adequate account. But one might also be interested in providing a prescriptive account of what should be deemed rigorous. And so I think that most of the standard view of mathematical rigor falls into that second category. We want to focus exclusively on what should be deemed rigorous, and so you give this account from formalizability. Most of the objections to that account come from the fact that it's not extensionally adequate in mathematical practices, and certainly not in physical practices. So I think what we should be trying to do is provide some sort of account that has a bit of both and links them. Okay? So we're trying to find this balance. We want something that gives us reliability and stability, similar to formalization, while still matching most of mathematical practice. So a goal here is to explicate those norms hidden in the practice, so that the account I give you of rigor is not itself a rigorous account of rigor. Okay? It's an attempt to explicate these practices. So I think that it's distinctly social in this account. And I call it the audience view. It's the idea that derives the idea derives from this sort of tagline that a proof is what convinces. Okay? And the interesting part for us is who it's meant to convince. Right? So I think that the audience view can help us reveal the role of perceived capacities in rigor judgment in mathematics, physics, philosophy, all throughout. So let's propose it. So the idea is coming from this sort of rhetorical and legal groundwork or background. We all have real audiences that we encounter. You guys have real audiences right now. You guys smile, you frown, etc. You tell me that that's wrong or that that's not truth preserving. And so I learn things from you. So here I have a bunch of philosophers of physics, but before I give a talk to a bunch of real philosophers of physics, I try to imagine philosophers of physics. Much hope, right? Because I want a good talk. Okay? So the idea is that we create, through our experiences, we create a sort of mental heuristic called a particular audience. And what happens is that those particular audiences are developed along a dimension. The dimension philosopher of physics, the dimension mothers, the dimension scientists, etc. Okay? And what makes them particular is that we've picked a particular dimension. Okay? All of you are many, many, many things. You're not just a philosopher of physics, and so I can never really argue to solely a philosopher of physics. Okay? It's only this sort of abstract concept. But we call them audiences because there seems to be a sort of mental back and forth with these heuristics. It's not like a list of rules. It's a sort of imagined person or imagined version of a person or a group of people. Okay? And the idea is that we can develop them along lots of different dimensions, and I've argued in other work that I think the dimension mathematicians are interested in is called reasonableness. Okay? So when they're thinking about giving proofs, they often talk about the sort of we already discussed a little bit the acontextuality, but many mathematicians seem to think that if you give a proof, it should remain, it should continue to persist as a proof, it should continue to be rigorous, that anybody who was up to date on the relevant mathematical facts would have to accept the conclusion of the proof and the steps involved in that proof. So really, they're not necessarily thinking, I've argued this before, we can push on it in the Q&A, but they're not really thinking about an audience composed of mathematicians exactly like. They think it's broader than that. It's mathematicians of the future, it's physicists if they were brought up to date on the relevant facts, it's the guy on the street. If the guy on the street knew enough about mathematics, he would see the rigor of the proof. Okay? So the idea is that what the mathematician is going to work with is this audience, this mental audience, defined by reasonableness, instead of being defined by being a mathematician or being a mother, etc. And this audience actually has a name in the literature on rhetoric. It's called the universal audience. I don't know if it's the best name, but that's the name that they've gone with. So this universal audience is an audience that's supposed to be defined exclusively by what we think is reasonableness. What do we think reasonableness is? Well, we have to experience it in the world. It's like deeply pragmatic. I think that if we want to give like a full background for it, we should adopt a kind of virtue epistemology, and reasonableness is a kind of virtue. We can talk about that too. And so an argument to this universal audience is meant to be, is it really? Does it really meet its goals? Not usually. But it's meant to be such that any person capable of understanding the reasons and therefore thinking the mathematical facts must accept the conclusion. So we call it universal because we think that reasonableness is universal amongst people. And we call it an audience because, again, we're doing that back and forth in our head when we're developing the arguments. So what's interesting about this is that the way we develop any kind of mental audience is by experiencing real audiences. And we all experience different real audiences, and we all have slightly different abstractions from those real audiences. And so in many ways, it's quite particular. It's based on our actual real experiences with real people deemed reasonable. And so we can only conceive of it as being universal. It won't actually include every person, and each one of us would have a different realization or different mental heuristic for these audiences. How do we learn to do it? Well, we do it throughout our entire lives. Okay, the second you're first introduced to people as being reasonable as a child, and you start to argue with them, you start to develop this concept of what a reasonable person will agree to and what they won't agree to. So what is the audience view of rigor? Well, it states that a proof is rigorous when the inferences in the proof convince a universal audience. And so we get 3 levels. We'll go through them quickly. We get these agential judgments, which is when a single mathematician, physicist, etc. judges a proof to be rigorous. A community level judgment, and a sort of prescriptive judgment, right? We didn't want to leave behind the what should be rigorous. So we'll give some norms for making our practices better or good or bad. So, it also gives us gradability or degrees of rigor. So this is important because I think that most mathematical proofs have degrees of rigor. We often say this proof is more or less rigorous than another, or we're making some sort of progress in that way. So a practitioner will judge a proof to be fully or partially rigorous when all or some of the inferential moves in that proof are ones that the practitioner's universal audience assents to. So this is a particular person with a particular concept of reasonableness and a particular kind of mental heuristic. And so what happens when some of those inferences are not validated by the universal audience or assented to by the person's universal audience is they might fill them in with particular audiences. You might say, well, that stuff, like, not everybody would agree, but, like, everybody in my field of knot theory would agree. Everybody knows that. And so you get something that's quite rigorous, if that's the only step, where it's, like, very particular. So you get, like, a large amount of rigor, but it's not perfectly rigorous. And this is what we talk about, well, what mathematicians seem to say when they look at other fields. In particular, like, combinatorics versus, like, knot theory, you really are saying, like, knot theorists, they have, a different standard of rigor than me. Or vice versa. But we can still account for that. It can still make sense. We can see our own proofs as largely rigorous, or mostly rigorous, or more rigorous than someone else's. And so we have this very natural version of checking to see if a proof is rigorous. We just ask whether the inferences would convince everyone, or whether they're very particular to a certain kind of group. Okay? This is very different than the standard view of rigor, where supposedly the way we check to see if a proof is rigorous, if we're confused, would be to try and figure out whether it could be formalized. And that's, of course, not what mathematicians do. If it were, they would be deferring to logicians a lot more than they actually do. And then we can also look at how a community might judge a proof to be rigorous. So a mathematical proof could be fully or partially rigorous for practice, and those practices might just be knot theorists in like the 1950s, 1960s, something like that. Or it might be a much larger practice, like modern Western mathematics. So we can ask if a proof is fully or partially rigorous. Would enough members of that practice judge the proof itself to be fully or partially rigorous? Okay. And of course, we know that enough mathematicians is often not very many mathematicians, in part because you might just have 2 referees who actually read the proof all the way through. Do those referees actually do that? That's a different kind of question. But we might think that if you have training that's representative of that practice, then you can stand in to fill that enough quality. Okay, so I think that typically what we're talking about when we talk about mathematical proofs that are rigorous are proofs that are recognized as rigorous in community or in practice in. And our adequate ongoing training in that practice adjusts one's universal audience, because you are arguing with real other people who are also trying to abstract what reasonableness is. And so we have a way that things can separate, right? You might judge something to be rigorous and discover that it's actually not rigorous in the community, in part by this ongoing argumentation, this feedback loop. Great. So then here's a natural question. We've only given a description. How do we know that these practices are good or bad? Or are they doing better or worse than each other? We want some sort of prescriptive account, in part because we think that rigor has given us a lot more reliability, a lot more certainty in mathematics historically. And so here's my first sketch. We can talk about it a lot, obviously. But a mathematical proof is fully or partially rigorous when all or some of the moves in the proof are such that a well-constructed universal audience is sensed to them. So what does it mean to construct a universal audience well? Well, I don't know yet. But I do know one way to construct it poorly, and that's what we'll talk about next. So I think that it's going to have something to do with representing a majority of real, reasonable people, in part because I want to ground, I don't want this to be super circular. I think that the reasonableness is where we should bottom out. It's a kind of virtue that people can have, real epistemic virtue. But our development and concept of rigor is deeply pragmatic. So let's think about this. So then we can think about a way that we can connect rigor and reliability. If these people, these reasonable people, it's really an epistemic virtue, it really leads to truth in some way, then having more people who are reasonable and encountering them and arguing with them and probably constructing my universal audience along those lines should lead to reliability, which was our goal of a prescriptive account of rigor. So these rigorous proofs are reliable in part because they try to overcome potential disagreement from any reasonable person. This is the dream. The more reasonable people we can convince of an inference, the higher the chances that we've got a good proof. All right. So here's what's interesting is that, well, interesting for us, all of it's interesting to me, unfortunately. What's interesting here is that all parts of this audience view rely on the concept of a universal audience. It relies on the concept of reasonableness. That's a social concept, right? We're being influenced by what other people call reasonable and who we see as reasonable in a particular kind of community. And so this is the objection that was raised. Well, then that social concept, my universal audience, could be influenced by identity prejudice. We know that we have identity prejudices in our real experiences. We know that there are certain kinds of injustices. So why wouldn't that extend to mathematics? I don't think that's an objection. I think that that's, unfortunately a case in point. So now we can explore those cases of epistemic injustice using that view. And I say in mathematics, but the example we'll actually discuss is also in physics. And just before we move on, I also want to say that this theory of rigor is continuous across domains. We would still say that you can have a fully or partially rigorous proof in physics in the exact same formation process. You would just replace those particular audiences for this sort of sketchy steps. You replace them with physicists you know instead of mathematicians you know. And the same for philosophy and also for legal contexts. Okay, so I want to think about a community-wide example of epistemic injustice in physics involving mathematical rigor. And I want to characterize a core virtue for successfully constructing a universal audience. Because I told you that we didn't know how to well construct a universal audience yet. I really don't, but I know one bad way. So we're going to try and cash out how to avoid that bad way. So I think there's a pretty obvious way that this might happen. I call it a blocked rigor judgment. It occurs when a stereotype, say take the stereotype, women are unreasonable, they rely on emotions, not logic. We'll carry this stereotype to the rest of our talk here. So the idea is that if you accept this stereotype, if women are unreasonable, then of course they're not a reasonable person. They don't belong to the universal audience required for mathematical rigor or physicist rigor. And so they can't possibly give a rigorous proof. This is the worst, most stereotyped version of an epistemic injustice this. And so what might happen is that a mathematician might refuse to read a proof written by a woman in virtue of this prejudice. Did it happen historically? I'm sure it did. Does it happen now? I really hope not. Okay? But the interesting part here is that we can identify that epistemic injustice as related to the capacity for rigor. That reasonableness part is what moves from the general stereotype into a mathematical stereotype. If we're formalizationists about rigor, it's harder to make sense of that situation. Because either the proof is rigorous or it's not, because it either can be translated into a formal proof or it can't be. And we hope that blind peer review overcomes these instances. We can also have suboptimal agential judgments due to participatory injustices. And I don't want to get too far into that because I have a different case study for that, and it's not a physics case study. But the idea is that systematic participatory injustice can deny a person the access to real audiences required to generate a concept of a universal audience. And that would lead to this sort of severance between reliability and rigor for a particular agent. Likewise, if you, as an agent, refuse to engage with half of the population because that half of the population is unreasonable, then you're also lacking the access to the real physical audiences required to generate your abstract concept. So limitation with real audiences causes this kind of self-fulfilling harm. A budding mathematician is denied a functional concept of rigor on the basis of an identity prejudice. I think that this happens historically, and my case study, if you want to talk about it later, is so germane. But what I want to talk about today is these community failures of rigor. So I think that those participatory injustices can affect community level or community-wide rigor judgments, and I think we have a legitimate example of that. Involving von Neumann's proof of the no hidden variables theorem. So, it happens when this sort of shared concept of a reasonable person in a community fails to sort of align with real reasonable people, and in particular due to an epistemic injustice. So I think that a natural way to avoid this would just be to include a range of reasonable people from diverse backgrounds in the mathematical community, but we'll hold that to the side and see the example. Okay, so in 1932, von Neumann proved that hidden variable theories of quantum mechanics were impossible. But in 1966, John Bell showed that there was a silly assumption in the proof. Essentially, he assumes that the linearity of expectation for hidden variables, which you shouldn't assume if there potentially could be hidden variables. Okay? So it's like a circular proof. And John Bell really does call it just silly. It's a silly assumption. He doesn't know why anybody would accept it, and why anybody would think that. But what's interesting about this case is that Greta Hermann published almost exactly the same objection as John Bell in 1935. That's almost 30 years. Well, it's over 30 years, actually. So what happened? Why was it immediately picked up that this proof was spurious when John Bell said it, but not when Greta Hermann said it? And this has been an interesting discussion more in like the history of science lately, where people are genuinely trying to figure out why it was overlooked. No, she was the only one who had that correctly. It's important, too, that she's right? This assumption is a circular proof. Okay? So here are some of the reasons that have been given in the history of science as to why her objection was ignored. The first is the choice of journal, so it just wasn't widely disseminated. Okay. The second is that the size of the font she used to publish the objection was actually quite small. And so, I'm not kidding. So, obviously she didn't attribute any importance to it. Okay. Her later papers on quantum mechanics didn't mention it. She doesn't have a lot of later papers on quantum mechanics because she had to flee Germany from the Nazis, and she had to get married to hide and everything. So she doesn't have a lot of later papers to begin with, and she certainly doesn't mention it in her other papers. The fourth one is her personality. They said that she was quite conciliatory and she didn't want to make a fuss about this objection. Her political views might have been another one that's provided because she was a socialist. Her youth and her sex, right? So those are two classics down there. So I want to think about these first few because I think that they're more they're not an epistemic injustice necessarily, but I don't think that they're actually good explanations. So the choice of journal, of course, unpopular journals are unlikely to be read by important physicists and thus won't lead to dissemination. That seems true. The problem is, we know that the paper was read by important physicists, including Heisenberg, who read it and left a commentary on it, and he said that it was really a very good paper, and it was quite fantastic. So there is evidence that it was read by important physicists at the time it was published. So it doesn't seem necessary that, like, she picks the best journal if she already knows, if she already knows that it's being read and received by the important figures in the field at the time. Okay? So I don't think that that's a particularly impressive option. This part about font size is a little bit bizarre. The idea is that this objection was written in a smaller font, which suggests that it's not important. But she titles the section "The Circle in von Neumann's Proof." She seems to think that it has some importance. I'm not sure she had any control over the size in which the paper was published. So I think that this sort of inference is a bit bizarre. I don't think it holds water. Then, of course, her later papers on quantum mechanics don't mention it. It's true, of course. But the implication that that means that she thought it wasn't important or legitimate is a bit bizarre. Bell only had to publish it once, and then people sort of started talking about it, discussed it.
But also, what are the later papers about? Maybe they're not about the same aspects of quantum mechanics.
Yeah. Yeah, so she's more interested in the philosophical aspects later. So it's I don't know. It's a weird explanation as well, I think. Which leaves 4 potential explanations in the literature. Her personality, this sort of conciliatory nature, which I think is also weird to attribute to her. It's a bit bizarre. Her political views, her youth, or her sex. And all 4 of these are part of her social identity. Right? They're not part of her mathematical practice or mathematical proof. These are issues of her social identity. And I think that they all have associated prejudices related to reasonableness, right? Women are unreasonable, they follow logic, etc. You're too young to really know, these sorts of things. Political views and conciliatoriness. Again, conciliatoriness is going to be very similar to that shyness that we saw in the first discussion of participatory injustice. And so she is harmed epistemically by having her rigor judgments systematically ignored on the basis of her identity. But it also harms, it harms her as a physicist, it harms other physicists, and it propagates this community-wide lapse in rigor. Okay? So everyone is continuing on believing that this proof is a proof when it's very much not a proof for 30 years. So I think it's an example of how the relationship between epistemic injustice, that concept of an audience defined on reasonableness, and the idea of mathematical rigor can play together, and in particular in physics. So I think that the audience view helped us to kind of explore this case, and I want to propose a way of avoiding epistemic injustices in both mathematics and physics proof using this. Well, when we return to that idea of a prescriptive view, the idea is that we have to sort of interact with enough real, reasonable people in some way. And so I think that in order to do good mathematics, you have to exhibit this virtue of participatory justice. You have to really consider who it is you allow to argue with and to receive their arguments. And when you're thinking about who is reasonable and who is not, you have to reflect on whether or not those stereotypes are social stereotypes of reasonableness. So that's the suggestion, that's the hope. And so that's what the virtuous mathematician and the virtuous physicist can do. They can ask themselves to reflect on identity prejudices and reasonableness. And then we can sort of incorporate more diverse voices into the field to try and replicate the real reasonable people we might experience. Okay, so I think these genuine epistemic injustices do happen surrounding rigor in mathematics and physics. I think that we have I have a really interesting concept of rigor that we can extend into physics that is deeply local, and also specific to certain communities. And you just have to use that social concept of rigor to sort of explain these epistemic injustice cases. And maybe it can help us avoid lapses in rigor, thus improving the mathematics and physics itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. This is perfectly on time. So we have 15 minutes for questions. Kareem, why don't you start?
Thanks, it was really fascinating. I tried to look up the paper, but I couldn't find the details. But so Pablo Cunha has these articles arguing that von Neumann actually didn't provide a kind of dodgy proof. And in some ways Bell misrepresented what he did. The Bell and Merman's representation of von Neumann's proof was the problematic thing. I think the idea is that the von Neumann proof is still valid, but it's just very, very, very restricted.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that in some ways, it seems like it's a kind of muddy picture. I don't know if you know. I didn't really remember the details, but I can send you Pablo's article. Do you know about this?
Yeah. So I have heard that it's like it can be sort of saved by this sort of restriction, and I think that that's fine, right? I don't think that that has any necessarily any bad outcome for this, right? Because the proof itself, as an unrestricted proof, fails to be rigorous.
So at least the claim that I understood it is that the way von Neumann presents himself is rigorous. It's the way that Bell presented what von Neumann did, which makes it look like what. But I wouldn't be able to get into the weeds of exactly what.
Okay.
But just basically last year or the year before at a conference, there was Pablo presented on this, and there was a lot of shouting and disagreement. So,
okay.
so I think there's kind of a lot of I know that Guido Bacigalupi is doing work on Herman at the moment, so maybe this will all get
resolved. Yeah.
But, I can send you Pablo.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
But I really, really enjoyed the talk. It was just a note on the literature.
Yeah, so I think that if it's the case that it's presented as restricted, I mean, my understanding was that it wasn't presented as restricted in this way, then it's a much more complicated story. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really, really like this way of viewing rigor. Just before my question, maybe just a comment on this change. I know that there is an article from Dennis Deeks in 2017 who compares Bell's criticism and Greta Herman's criticism, and I think Pablo Cunha's kind of building on that.
Exactly.
This article I think is really well. I understood better the fudging over if it was rigorous or not than from Cunha's papers. So my question is quite related to that. Is it of any importance at all that von Neumann's theorem is kind of a physical theorem, meaning that as a mathematical theorem is perfectly rigorous? Like the assumption in question is that why would you want physical hidden variables which are a physical thing to obey this mathematical restriction that he put? But as a mathematical theorem, it's rigorous. So is it of interest to discuss, I don't know, how the physics aspect of it is related to if it's a rigor judgment in the physical community, in the mathematical community?
Yeah, so I think it does make a difference, and I think it's important because what makes it a silly assumption is this relation to the physical facts or the physical objects. But I think that happens in mathematics as well. We can have silly assumptions about mathematical objects too. And I think that what makes this one interesting is the silly assumption about a physical object. I think there might be other cases where purely mathematical theorems, proofs of purely mathematical theorems, can also have assumptions that seem silly in relation to their mathematical objects. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right that also everyone evaluating this is a physicist, and so it matters to them that it's in relation to the physical objects.
Okay. Yeah.
My cue is James and Alex.
Okay. I had some clarificatory questions about the audience view, I guess, because the notion of degrees of rigor that you get from it, because there was a slide where you you kind of defined partial rigor at one point as some of the inferential moves as being acceptable by your well-constructed universal audience or something.
Yeah, some
So
yeah.
I read that as kind of like, you can have a proof with no like unallowed moves, and that would be maximally rigorous. And then, if it's got a few steps that are dodgy, then it's less rigorous, and that's like your degree of rigor. I guess I was kind of surprised that what I would have initially thought with the title of the audience view that it would be relativized to, like it would be sort of like the notion of partial rigor would come from the fact that we're changing our universal audience, but some of your later comments did suggest that you were thinking about it that way, so I was a bit confused about whether because initially you said the universal audience is like every reasonable person, but then at one point you said something like the physicist's reasonable audience, the physicist's universal audience versus the mathematician's universal audience, and I was just a bit confused by how this all pans out.
Yeah, so I have a universal audience. And my universal audience largely stays the same. Like I never, unless I encounter some like really significant instances where I question what is actually reasonableness. Like this really overhauls my concept. But I don't have like two versions of the universal audience inside my head. I only have one. It's very difficult, in fact, to like think outside of that, to say that like, oh, these people, like, this happens in particular when you're, like, arguing about logic and whether or not you should be a pluralist about logic. It's so hard to get outside of classical logic in your meta language that it's, like, difficult to really separate the two. So you don't have multiple universal audiences. You only have one concept of it. But each person's concept will be slightly different. Just like, I've encountered lots of different kinds of dogs. When I think of a dog in my head, it's typically a small one, but maybe you think of a dog and it's a large one because you've encountered a lot more large dogs or something like that. Okay? But we still have concepts of dogs. So the difference is that you have a different concept of the universal audience than I do. Okay. And then when I evaluate a proof, I'm checking to see whether or not those inferences are such that I think that my universal audience would assent to them. Of course, the universality of that, the difficulty of getting out of it makes me think that it's actually quite similar to yours or similar to someone else's, and so other people would also accept it because we have this aligned universal audience. Empirically, that's not true necessarily, but it's hard to think outside of that. So then what happens when something is partially rigorous, it means that I'm looking at the proof and I'm saying that my universal audience would assent again and again and again. Oh, but there's this one step that I don't actually think that everybody would agree to. But I know everybody in my department would agree to it, or everybody at the conference I'm going to will agree to it. Okay? And so then I might say that this is a partially rigorous proof. It's largely rigorous. Something that had a lot more steps, I think, would be less rigorous to me than the original proof. There's only one step that's very particular. It's limited to a field or a group or a community. And I think that field or group or community would accept it. I think it's much clearer when you think about teaching mathematics or teaching proofs, right? You try to break it down to its very most basic steps. You think about these students as really not having the background knowledge for particular jumps or particular inferences. And so you have to give them things that are maximally rigorous. There is no necessarily maximally rigorous proof, but I can think of a proof as rigorous as it gets. Right? So the proofs I give to my students are as rigorous as it gets. And sometimes the proofs that they see in their books are not as rigorous as it gets, and so I have to give them more steps or different steps. Although they're acceptably rigorous, and they're rigorous within certain communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So the maximum, the highest we get is, this is as rigorous as it gets. That's the sort of thought process.
Anna?
Thanks, Zoe. That was great. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm kind of really sympathetic to the view. I have a quick comment before I find my question. So I might want to say in the sense that even in cases where you're not adopting a social concept of rigor, you can still have participatory injustice whereby the proofs or the methods or the scientific knowledge produced doesn't gain uptake based on identity prejudices and so on. So you kind of like can enlarge, in a sense, the dimension of rigor that you can talk about. But I think like my quibble is more with like locating the epistemic injustice to some extent, or maybe not even, because you say that basically you define the participatory injustice as an agent, when an agent is viewed as incompetent to carry out an epistemic task. And I'm kind of like finding it hard in a sense to locate, in a sense, who's responsible for the epistemic injustice to some extent. Because at least as defined by kind of like Hookaway and Grasswick and a lot of the other people and so on, it seems that in the Greta Herman case, she published, she was doing the work, she published, so it's not like she was denied participation in science or in the process of knowledge production as such. So she did all that. And it seems like a lot of people, like Heisenberg commented on the proof and so on, so it gained some uptake in the community. So then it doesn't seem that that's where the locus of the epistemic injustice really is. So then it seems that there's kind of like some post factum constructions, historically, whereby she becomes historically silenced or marginalized. And the historical injustice resides in that process rather than in the contemporary process of knowledge production. So, in a sense, there's kind of like this historical injustice that I think is really important to think about when we're trying to understand what are the kind of like harms of knowledge production injustices. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So
I'll add one more thing in a sense, like, because the original von Neumann was 1935, and the kind of like Bell thing was 1965. You may also think at the time that the community received this original proof of Greta Herman, they were like, okay, that makes sense, so we agree on that, and we're kind of like, and then someone else came later and they kind of like forgot about everything that was going on.
Okay.
I think that needs more unpacking.
I think you're right. I think it probably does need more unpacking. I wasn't thinking that it was sort of...
Because it then resembles more a historical injustice than an epistemic injustice. So that's really my point. So if you want to like ensure that this is like a genuine epistemic injustice, it has to like concern the contemporary aspect of the denial of participation rather than the kind of like historical injustice link, which is, like...
Yeah, so first, I don't think that it has to be contemporary to be an epistemic injustice. I think we can harm someone as a knower by forgetting their work or ignoring it, even if it's 4 or 5 years later.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So like it could be both historical and epistemic in that sense. The question, it's an interesting question though, the extent to which the contemporary part involves an epistemic injustice. And so I think that like we have a couple of physicists who do case treatment, right? But they don't actually change their practices on the basis of that. They read it, they say it's good, and then they don't actually incorporate that knowledge in any way, or that objection in some way. And so like that, I think that's the locus of the contemporary epistemic injustice. And just because you're allowed to talk doesn't necessarily mean that you're allowed to participate, right? Participation involves more than just being allowed to speak or to publish, right? I mean, Sophie Germain, also an example where she is eventually allowed to publish. She has to do it herself, and much to the chagrin of the Paris Academy of Sciences. But like, she's allowed to publish, but that's a bare minimum for participation in an epistemic activity, certainly involving like a back and forth of sort of proofs and refutations. When we have that proofs and refutations part, if it's not taken up just because you speak, that's not necessarily participation, successful participation. That's the way I'm thinking of it. but it's worth unpacking that a lot more.
So time is up, but Alex has been very patient, so we're going to ask a question.
Thanks, Zoe, about this. Really interesting. I guess I'm sort of similar to the question I had for Kareem. I'm worried about if there's any objective standards or something for rigor. Like, I'm not sure that it seems uncomfortable for us to say that a community of flat earthers that have their own standards of rigor, and then, like, you know, you can say that a proof that they provide that the earth is flat is rigorous because it accords to their, like, what's reasonable according to their conception of a universal audience. I think that there's a standard way in which we use words rigor when we want to be a little bit more kind of factive than that. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of way of adding that as sort of an element in your conception of what rigor involves, and if that would allow something like, you know, I mean, like the examples of epistemic, so this is a similar point that Jingy was making, you know, these examples of epistemic injustice I think would survive such an element, and was it Anna?
Yeah.
Did you not speak? Okay, fine.
Sorry,
I attributed something to Jingy, but it was to you, and I'm sorry.
Is it because we're both shiny?
I think it's because I had a little bit of wine at lunch. But so the idea is that, I mean, this conception of epistemic injustice in rigor would allow for such a thing, but it might still be more amenable to people's general understanding of what rigor involves.
Yeah, so I want to keep at the community level the possibility that there is a community who defines rigor in such a way that the flat earthers, okay?
Right.
In part because I also want there to be communities of logicians who are, I mean, I think that they're reasonable people, and yet they have quite insane logics that they're endorsing. And like, I think that they can have a standard of rigor within that community, and I think we would not deny that to them. So, what's like, where does the more objective part come in, or the say factive part? It's the move to how those universal audiences in that community are constructed, and that's going to be like what's interesting. So I told you before that I want to I told you all before that I want to bottom it out in reasonableness as a legitimate epistemic virtue. And if that's the case, then what happens in the flat earther community that maybe doesn't happen in a pair-consistent logic, or the logical community, is that the flat earthers are not actually arguing with people who exhibit the virtue of reasonableness, whereas the logicians are.
Okay, so you're smuggling in the kind of factivity
into the reasonableness, yeah, as a virtue, yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, so that's what's happening.
Cool.
But within the community, you may not be able to recognize that at all. You think you have rigorous arguments as a flat earther, and like that matches the phenomenology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. I think we all should get some coffee.